Habits of Happiness is sponsored and hosted by the Mindful Life program. The Mindful Life program helps people engage in life in healthy and meaningful ways, reducing stress while cultivating genuine happiness. They offer programs locally, internationally, and online. More information at www.mindfullifeprogram.org or 970-633-0163.
Habits of Happiness is also sponsored by Paradise Bakery, located in the heart of Aspen on the corner of Galena and Cooper. A favorite hangout since 1981. Famous for fresh-baked cookies and muffins, serving homemade Italian-style ice cream, lattes, and fine coffees. Open daily from 6:30 a.m. to 11 p.m.
Welcome to Habits of Happiness. My name's John Bruna.
And I'm Laura Bartels. And together we run the Mindful Life program. We're based in Carbondale, Colorado, but we offer mindfulness programs all over the United States, into Canada, and with our co-founder and colleague in Australia.
Right, well, it's so good to spend another session with you, Laura. You know, today's show is entitled The Myths of Happiness, and
there are a few, aren't there?
there are. Quite a provocative title, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it would be nice to just sort of recap what we did cover in our first program.
That would be great.
In our first program, we really wanted to unpack the definition of happiness. We have a show, Habits of Happiness. Well, we want to know what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe we really came to a conclusion that when we think about happiness, we're much more than just stimulus-driven pleasure, much more than these moments of feeling good. And in fact, happiness is much more tied to meaning in our life, to how we engage in life. So a sense of well-being that really comes about as a sense of living a life that you feel good about.
Right. And it's that sort of underlying, foundational, long-lasting feeling rather than sort of what happens on the top of the ocean, the waves of happiness and sadness at that level.
Right. So, that calls to mind what we talked about in the last show was when we ask people about how happy are you, what's your level of happiness? Well, they're not reflecting necessarily how giddy they are at the moment. They kind of take a deeper look at their life. How happy am I, right?
That's true.
And so when we're talking about cultivating happiness then, I think it's safe to say that the habits of happiness are those that really lead to inner peace, to well-being, to a sense of meaning in your life that feels pretty good most of the time.
Yeah, and that really are that sustaining base for us that allows us to be resilient in those times of challenges and, unexpected things in our lives.
Right, sort of the depth of the ocean, right? We have the moments of life that have the ups and downs, but really, if we're living a life we feel good about, we're able to really respond to the events that are challenging in ways that actually cultivate more happiness overall in our life. Right.
But, we get confused about this, so that's why we're doing this episode on myths. And what was your subtitle?
Looking for happiness in all the wrong places. You brought that up in the last show, and I think it'd be a great country and western song.
That's right.
Yeah, but we all do it. And this is a real important thing to explore because at our base, as we talked about, we want to be happy. I mean, people wake up and we want to be happy. We want to find a life that's meaningful, pleasurable, and feels good. I mean, that's our driving force.
And we work to avoid suffering, avoid those things that don't lead us there.
Right, yeah. So that falls in line with sort of that big view His Holiness 14th Dalai Lama will always say. Everyone wants happiness and everyone wants to avoid suffering. It's kind of a universal truth.
Yeah, very human. Very human truth.
So in that quest, though, if we were to ask someone, well, what would I know you want to be happy, so what's that look like to you? What do you think the common response would be?
Yeah, well, bigger salary or the vacation I was, dreaming about. That's really that's where my next happiness is going to come from. But it's often these sort of short-lived sensory pleasures.
And even things that are, that last longer but don't necessarily provide happiness longer, right? So that common sort of response to I want a happy life interviews, right? I want a good job, a nice relationship, a house, a good car, especially up here in the wintertime, a car with heated seats.
Right. Four-wheel drive and heated
Four-wheel
seats.
drive,
Right. That'll
heated
do.
seats, and
Yeah.
comfortable, and the vacation you talked about, and that's going to make me happy.
Right. Right. And we find that doesn't, we get that new job that we thought would really be or that new relationship, and we often find that isn't, really a lasting happiness. It might, be great for a while, that raise that we got or that award that we thought would make such a difference.
You mean to tell me that I can have a good job, a good relationship, a nice car, and a good, really luxurious house and still be unhappy?
Well,
How could that possibly be?
I do think it happens. I do think it happens. We find that. Find it to be true.
You mean there's people with all that still have stress and worry and fear and anxiety? And really?
Yeah, yeah.
How could that possibly be?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's some of the myths, and so we should dive into that. So, partly what we're talking about is the hedonic treadmill, where we keep thinking that the next thing is going to do it.
Right, the hedonic treadmill.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. It's hedonic treadmill. Hedonic in this sense is really stimulus-driven pleasure, right? Hedonic. It feels good.
Right.
And, so much of our life is spent around getting the next thing that feels good, whether it's a nice ski, whether it's a nice car, whether it's a good dinner, a new flat screen TV, a bigger flat screen TV. And I think we all know when we reflect that those things are never going to provide a lasting happiness.
Right. And it's not that you want to avoid those things, right? I mean, they
Right.
can play a role, and we don't want to have a life that's devoid of some of these things we're talking about.
Right. I think what you're hinting at there is the, things are nice. It's good to feel good, but it's really important to distinguish between its ability, this person outside myself, to provide me any lasting happiness, to not exaggerate those qualities. I'm calling to mind a chart that I saw on value and happiness,
Right.
and they had this great bar graph that said how the value and how much meaning something has just before you buy something. So this bar is just before I buy it, I'm really excited about it. As soon as I buy it, my happiness, it's really, important to me. A month later, a year later, and then if I lose it, suddenly I'm attached to it again.
Right. Right.
And, so I think that sort of piece really draws the attention to the things and events in our lives. While they seem so big in that moment of the purchase or the the date or the vacation or when I buy the house or when I get the new job, at that point they seem so big and all-encompassing, but a day later, a month later, 3 months later, it just doesn't hold up.
That's true.
So what's the science show on this?
So, with the hedonic treadmill idea, really it looks at this idea that we tend to think that it's that next thing that's going to provide us happiness. So it's looking at the future and imagining that next thing is going to do it. And we find that we get to that place, and then we drum up the next thing that we think is going to do it. And it just keeps going. And again, it's largely focused on this idea of hedonic or stimulus-driven, things from outside, but not necessarily things that what we're bringing to the world.
Right. So, what you're talking about is leading me to Dan Gilbert's work. And so a researcher at Harvard who really has explored and documented happiness. I mean, if you really want to talk about science of happiness, he's really under some incredible material. And he's found this impact theory, I think it's called,
Yeah,
or impact bias. Right,
yeah,
impact bias.
right.
And that's where we tend to exaggerate the happiness and even the difficulties events and things in our life are going to have on us.
Right, yeah. Looking at future events or circumstances, right, he talks about how we tend to really blow out of proportion what that's going to do for us in one direction or another.
Right. I think his term is simulated, we simulate the experience before it happens, and we over-exaggerate its qualities.
Right. Yeah, he talks about how the human brain really is the only species, we're the only ones able to sort of imagine that and
to how
create
something will
that.
be,
Yes.
and how it's going to turn out and how much joy it'll
We
bring.
run the simulation and then we judge.
Yeah, this will be awful, this will be wonderful. However, he mentioned that it's a pretty faulty simulator.
Right, doesn't work so well. Maybe a few kinks need to still be worked out, right?
Yeah. I think what I found most fascinating, so he's very provocative when he presents his information. There's a talk he gave that, he just gives the audience a test, and he says, so if you become a paraplegic, or if you win a lotto, who's going to be happier in a year, right?
Right.
Very provocative. I even heard Tony Robbins mimic this. It's a very provocative statement, and obviously we think, well, if I win the lotto,
of course,
I'm going to be much happier than if I lose my legs.
Yeah.
And research doesn't bear that out, does it?
No, it doesn't. In fact, he says 1 year later, when you reassess, those people are equally as happy. That they're sort of back to their set point of happiness, which is another term that's used.
Right, a set point. And that's a real interesting point that has come out of this. And I believe we have a graph that kind of pulls up this idea of factors of happiness. And most of the science and researchers agree on this general model. And within that, if you see the graph here, 50% of our happiness is our sort of set point. 50% of our ability to be happy, our well-being, is sort of predetermined. It's kind of our disposition. It's kind of our mid-level, right? Some people are a little more pessimistic. Some people tend to be a little more cheery. Some people tend to be a little happier. And a lot of that, some people say is genetics, it's your environment, it's your set point. And so I think in that analogy, whether you've lost your legs, whether you win a lottery, that happens at that time. It's really devastating and it's really exciting. But a year later, you've adjusted to winning the lottery. You've adjusted to losing your leg. Right. And you're back at your sort of set point. So 50% is sort of this way we are, right? Well, that leaves us 50 more percent. And so what do we do with this other 50?
Well, what you might think is that the other 50% is circumstances.
The events in your life,
the events,
the house,
the
car, the relationship.
Exactly, and we seem to operate that way. But what they find is it's only 10% of that pie chart that really speaks to circumstances and conditions in your life. And really 40% is more about, our attitudes, our choices, and what we bring to our life.
Well, let me get this straight. According to the science here, you're saying that the house, the car, the relationship, the good job, the getting the award and all that.
That all fits into 10%.
10%.
Exactly.
10% of my overall sense of happiness and well-being is determined by the factors of conditions in my life, circumstances.
Yeah. It's shocking, isn't it?
And that's where we're putting all our time and energy.
We do. We put all our time and energy there.
Hence the title.
Right.
The myth of happiness. Which calls to mind that sort of universal wisdom we've all heard and we've learned since we were children, right? Happiness is an inside job.
Right.
And it's not dependent upon these outside circumstances. It is to 10% apparently. So 10% of my overall happiness, well-being is really factored in whether I get the good job or I lose the good job, whether I get this relationship or lose this relationship. The circumstances of life is really only at 10%, and it sure seems that's where we're putting all of our energy, isn't it?
It's true. Now, there is something interesting about that 10%, and that is that, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we really do need to get past that basic need, and then after that, we really find some happiness that really doesn't change too much after that point. But that lower portion is very important to getting us that 10%.
Yeah, very important point. So yeah, you're referencing Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that really emphasizes that at the base of our pyramid, there's some basic needs that need to be met in order for anything to really happen. food, housing, you know, the ability to have warm clothes, shelter. So in his theories, he really looked at these basic needs as foundational. So those are important, and they play a much bigger role, I think, if you're homeless and living under a bridge, much more difficult than if you know where your next meal's coming from. Is that what you're
Absolutely,
saying?
yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier, too, something about salary as, you know, affecting that 10% as well.
Right, the good job, that'll make me happy. Money.
Right, but would you say that, you know, that's, you know, relational to, you know, more money always means more happiness?
Well, isn't that the natural formula?
Well, of course. I mean, that's what we're taught in our culture.
Yeah, I think you and I both know that doesn't really add up, does it?
It doesn't.
The
It
math
doesn't. We
add up.
certainly know people who have plenty of money who aren't finding that kind of happiness.
Really? There's people in those nice homes that still have stress and worries and fears and concerns and, yeah.
Yeah, and, you know, well, what we find is there is a point, up to a certain point, you know, that is important, just like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, up to $25,000 or $50,000, that can make a difference.
Right,
Meeting
okay.
those, helping us to meet those needs. After that point, from 50, let's say, to $500,000 annually, that we don't find that there's that much more happiness because of that salary increase.
Yeah, I know the study you're citing really found that once your basic needs are met up to 50,000, right, there's a huge increase in your ability to have happiness and well-being because you know where your shelter is, you have food. But from 50,000, I think it's actually to 5 million.
5
even.
million.
So millions.
Yes, that's correct.
That it's not at all proportional to any happiness in your life, and I think we can really see that that holds true.
Right, and it doesn't mean that, you know, if you're on one end or the other of that top group that you can't find happiness. But again, it's a skill to be cultivated. It's not a given because of your income.
Yeah. So coming back to Gilbert's work, and what we're looking at is 10% of our happiness is really determinant on circumstances. Good job, not good job, relationship, house, car, the events of my life. 40% is on how I live my life, my attitudes and how I participate in life and the things that I do, intentional living. So that graph really talked about intentional living in the 40%.
Right.
50% being my sort of set point. Now, if I look at that, and I remember in his work, he was talking about how we over-exaggerate. Hey, if I get this award, if I get this good job, if I get married, if I get divorced.
Sometimes that's what you're...
I'll be happy.
Right.
And he found that our simulator, our projection of how much happiness that will bring is just dead wrong, that we exaggerate. That's the impact bias that you mentioned. So the idea, which continually pops in our mind, is we spend all of our time focusing on the 10%. If I can change the outside world, it will make me happy. That doesn't really add up to what they're finding in the science, is it?
That's correct. Right. Right.
Yeah. So if I'm reading this right, the 40% intentional living, that's where I have influence. And as we talked about in the last show, the definition of happiness, the sense of happiness and well-being was really tied to meaning and value, how I live my life ethically, and that's really cultivating this sense of well-being. And it seems to me that this 40%, where I actually have some input, if I respond to life, the events, circumstances, whether it's a good job, whether I'm losing a job, whether I'm in a relationship, lose a relationship, if I respond to that in a way that's meaningful and healthy and beneficial in alignment with my values, that is actually going to have, tying this to new science, an impact on the 50%. Because if the 50% is genetic, set point, well, science now has shown that we get to rewire our brain, right?
Exactly. Exactly. What a beautiful thing that we can actually change our biology
Yeah, we can, through habits of happiness, putting a plug in here, we actually get to rewire our brain. We get to change even and have an influence on the 50%. So now working with the way things actually are, we have a chance with 90%. And yet most people are focused on the 10%.
On the 10%.
That's how we came up with the myths of happiness, is the idea that if I have a better job, a better relationship, a better car, and all those things that we focus on, well, they actually can take me out of my happiness and create more suffering, anxiety, and fear, because what do people worry about? They worry about the house, the car, the job, the relationship, and anxiety and fear and stress is around
Right.
maintaining those things that we exaggerate that will give us this happiness.
Exactly. And further, we actually try to control all that in such a strong way so that we can sort of manage that. But really, if we're focused more on the 40% in how we respond, whether the car starts or the car doesn't start, whether we get that job or we don't get that job, letting go of, thinking that we can control our partners, our the outer circumstances, but really look inside and look at how we're responding and what we're bringing to the situation. It reminds me about my own life, in that for a stretch of years a while ago, I had layers of personal challenges, things that sickness and car accidents and a whole variety of things. And the question that I would ask myself is, how can I move through this with grace? And I think that what I'm reflecting on now is that does two things. One, it accepts the circumstances. So I'm not saying I've got to control these, I've got to change it. It's like, this is what is. So once I've accepted it, now I'm turning the focus on that 40%. I'm saying, how am I going to respond to these challenging circumstances, these things that are really not in my control, even though I'm certainly going to take the steps that are healthy to improve the conditions and move through them. But it's turning that focus back to, what am I bringing, and how can I respond in a healthy way? And I think that really fits nicely into that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful illustration of really, I think, what the message we want to get across in the show is, we put so much emphasis on, I would be happier if that annoying person at work wasn't there. I'd be so much happier if I was healthier. And yet I know healthy people who aren't happy, and I know people who are not so healthy who are happy. And despite all evidence to the contrary, our problem, I think, in this suffering and anxiety and fear comes from the key word you talked about, acceptance. Right?
Right.
It's when we talk about acceptance, it doesn't mean that I like what's happening, right? It
Right.
means that, well, this is what's happening, and I now can stop resisting it. I can see it clearly. Now I'm empowered to respond to it, right? To change it, to do something about it.
Right, and we're not talking either that you wouldn't have boundaries or really protect yourself in a situation that's dangerous or damaging, really unhealthy situations.
Right. So here's the big myth, and I know we have to summarize these key points. The myth is, and I think where a lot of the friction around happiness and suffering comes in, is living in a world that doesn't exist, right? Living in a world where my car should start every time, where my job should be fine, where I don't get cancer, where my friends don't die, where things don't change, and then being really shocked and suffering around the fact that my car didn't start today, even though there's, auto garages that, have a whole industry built on. There's hospitals that deal with cancer, and there's this world that's messy. But in my mind, I think mine should not be messy. My car should start, and if I eat right and be healthy, I'll live long. And that just doesn't really add up, does it?
No, it really doesn't. It really doesn't.
Yeah. But keying into your point, to summarize, is that this 40%, which is really where we want to emphasize, is by responding to life in a way that we feel good about, that's healthy and meaningful, ethical, in alignment with my values, to use your words, to move through this with grace, that cultivates the inner peace and well-being and actually directly alters the 50%. And that's where we should put our focus.
Exactly. And that we can develop that through habits and cultivating these skills that help us to cultivate happiness.
Wonderful. And I know through our Mindful Life program, we offer lots of those skills and trainings and courses, but at each show I know we want to offer one tidbit of a habit of happiness. So I'd like to invite you to offer that to our viewers for the tip of the week to cultivate happiness in their own life.
Right. And so this week's tip for cultivating happiness in your own life is really around kindness and cultivating altruism. So this idea that, you can each day look at an opportunity to offer a kindness or choose an altruistic action that would benefit someone, and really cultivate that in a practice that you bring up every day. So try that this week and see what you learn.
So you're inviting that altruistic idea to do something of benefit. The research has shown that ties the same portion of the brain that has the pleasurable senses, whether it's eating a good meal and all those types of tendencies.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a wonderful tip, and we invite you to find a way to be a benefit of others. And I think a term His Holiness the Dalai Lama uses, that you use quite frequently,
Yes.
is it's a way of being wisely selfish.
Yes.
So
we get what we give, right?
yeah. So with that
Wonderful.
offering, I'd like to take a moment and thank all of our listeners out there and viewers. Thanks so much for sharing this time with us. We do hope that you found this beneficial, and we invite you to cultivate some genuine happiness in your own life. Please feel free, if you have any questions or want to learn more about us or the program, to visit the mindfullifeprogram.org, www.mindfullifeprogram.org.
Habits of Happiness is sponsored and hosted by the Mindful Life program. The Mindful Life program helps people engage in life in healthy and meaningful ways, reducing stress while cultivating genuine happiness. They offer programs locally, internationally, and online. More information at www.mindfullifeprogram.org or 970-633-0163.
Habits of Happiness is also sponsored by Paradise Bakery, located in the heart of Aspen on the corner of Galena and Cooper. A favorite hangout since 1981. Famous for fresh-baked cookies and muffins, serving homemade Italian-style ice cream, lattes, and fine coffees. Open daily from 6:30 a.m. to 11 p.m.